Robb Stark stood upon the battlements of Riverrun, heart heavy with duty. Grey wind prowled close at his side, an anxious shadow mirroring his every move. The young king in the north had won battles and lost dear friends. He had answered his father's execution with a triumphant rise and a crown of winter. Now, here he was, faced with a choice that would define the destiny of his house and the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Though war demanded swift justice against the Lannisters, politics demanded alliances. He understood it too well, yet the weight was no lighter for all his knowledge. A cool breeze drifted down from the distant mountains, ruffling the banners that hung from Riverrun's towers. The direwolf of House Stark, gray on white, snapped in the wind. Lord Edmure Tully had been urging Robb to finalize the terms with Walder Frey. The Tully forces needed a safe passage across the Twins, a strong alliance with that notoriously prickly house, and Walder Frey wanted his due. Robb had promised to marry one of Lord Walder's daughters, sight unseen, and he had bristled at the thought of binding himself to a stranger. But duty always weighed more heavily on the heart of a king than on any other man. Despite the presence of another in his mind, Talisa of Volantis or Jane Westerling, whichever version of fate might have captured his eye, Robb realized that the war would not permit him the luxury of personal desire. If Walder Frey had demanded the king in the north marry one of his daughters, then Robb would follow through. And so, on that windswept day at Riverrun, he resolved to keep his oath for the greater good of his cause and the realm he hoped to save from Lannister dominion. He made his preparations swiftly. Word reached the Twins that the king in the north, blessed by his bannermen and guided by the memory of his late father, was prepared to fulfill the pact. The hour to ride finally arrived, and Robb gathered his host. Grey wind loped at the head of the column, and the Frey guides carried their flags high. Near the front rode Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, his seasoned eyes scanning the fields, the rivers, and the banks for any signs of hidden foes. Behind them trailed a mix of Northmen and Rivermen knights, foot soldiers, and a baggage train that included the families of some lords who preferred to keep their kin close. Spirits were guarded but hopeful, for if the king in the north sealed a Frey alliance, the war might turn irreversibly against the Lannisters. They approached the Twins, those ancient twin castles that flanked the green fork of the Trident, bound by a massive stone bridge. The Freys, numerous and serious, waited upon the wide battlements. Walder Frey himself stood at the gates, surly and muttering, with a brood of children and grandchildren at his side. Robb's men noted the wary looks from Frey archers and the quiet tension among Frey footmen. But that tension was leavened by the knowledge that this was not a chance for slaughter. King Robb Stark was here to honor his word. There would be no slight to spark Walder Frey's notorious wrath. When Robb dismounted, grey wind at his heel, Lord Walder stood beneath the archway with parted lips, eyes gleaming with the promise of advantage. Everyone knew that despite his advanced age, Walder Frey's mind was sharp as an iron spike. He peered at Robb, took in the tall, broad-shouldered youth with the thick auburn hair of the Tullys and the gray eyes of the Starks. "Your Grace," he said in a voice that might have been a sneer or a greeting. "We are so pleased to see you." Robb inclined his head. "I am grateful for your welcome, Lord Walder," he said courteously. "I stand before you to fulfill the agreement that was made. House Stark does not break its word." Walder's thin mouth twitched upward. He cast his gaze around, counting the knights, appraising the Northmen's arms, then snapped his attention back to the young king. "I have heard talk," he said, "but I am glad to see for myself that talk is only talk. Come, we have prepared a feast, and you must meet the daughter who will have the honor of wedding a king." Robb's face remained solemn. No doubt Walder Frey took joy in reminding him that it was the bride who would be honored, not the groom. But Robb recalled the countless fallen in the war thus far. Honor had cost the Starks dearly, but so had the alternative. He gave a slight nod, and Lord Walder's brood parted to let him pass. Inside the walls of the first castle, the Freys had set a host of tables in the great hall. Long trestles groaned under the weight of roast meats, bread loaves, and flagons of wine and ale. The air was thick with the smells of spiced pork and fresh bread, mingling with the pungent smoke from innumerable torches. Around the hall, the Fry offspring sat in clusters, watching the king in the north intently. The bride was revealed at last. A girl of moderate looks, large eyes, and a certain timid air, though she seemed more poised than some of her siblings. She approached Rob with a graceful curtsy, and Rob inclined his head. He had prepared himself to be cordial no matter who was presented. This was not a romantic union but a political one. Duty first. The wedding ceremony took place that very evening, witnessed by the seven. Despite Rob's devotion to the old gods, it was Lord Walder's castle, so the rites had to accommodate the faith. If part of Rob yearned to stand beside a heart tree and say his vows, he kept the thought in his mind alone. The bride was named Rosalind, shy but sweet, her hand trembling in his for just a moment before she steadied herself. The hall erupted in applause when the septon concluded. This was the moment for which Walder Fry had pressed so hard. To see a king bound to his house, to tie the fortunes of House Fry to the new king in the north. Rob spared a polite smile for his bride, who managed a hesitant smile in return. One day, perhaps, they could learn to respect each other, if not to love. The feast began. Drums sounded, and pipes played as the guests partook of food and drink. The toasts were made. Rob found it a relief that the Frays, cunning though they were, had prepared an actual celebration rather than a trap. He had been uneasy riding here, uncertain of Walder Fray's intentions, but in fulfilling the betrothal, he had mollified the old man's dangerous pride. He drank sparingly, ignoring the jests thrown by some of Walder's brood. The music thrummed and died, began again and died again. At the high table, Lord Walder periodically cackled about the Starks' new ties to his house. Yet if cynicism sharpened his tongue, his sense of self-interest smoothed over the malice. That night, the king in the north and his queen retired to their chamber as man and wife. Rosalind Fry, with eyes downcast and cheeks blazing, entered quietly. She did not speak, and Rob did not press her. All around them, the castle hummed with the aftereffects of feasting. For better or worse, the alliance was forged. Within those stone walls, the seeds were planted that would alter the course of the war. There would be no red wedding here, no slaughter of Stark men while violins screeched the reigns of Castamere. Instead, there was only a cautious, uncertain union, with each side wondering if this new bond might truly hold. By morning's first light, Rob had begun to plan the next steps with his lords. The Frays would supply men, though Walder made it plain he would not command them personally. He left that to some of his stronger sons. Their loyalty might be half-hearted at best, but the king in the North's army had grown. Having secured the crossing and pledged himself in marriage, Rob looked upon the map, traced his fingers over potential routes, and contemplated his next move. Lord Bolton and Lord Karstark had pressed for a bold attack on Harrenhal or a deeper strike into the Westerlands, but that was before the fiasco at the Battle of the Fords and the blow inflicted by the Lannisters at Oxcross. Now, with the Freys fully in the fold, perhaps they might attempt to push south again. Word was that Tywin Lannister had marched east, perhaps to respond to the threat of Stannis Baratheon or to secure alliances in King's Landing. The moment seemed ripe to reclaim the advantage. Walder Fry, for all his irritations, was not lacking in strategic sense. He granted Rob access to the main crossing at the Twins, though he demanded that his men be allowed to hold the bridge behind them, ensuring that if Rob's forces were routed, Walder would still have the means to remain in control of his domain. The negotiation was prickly, but it was done. Soon, the battered, tired host of Stark and Tully loyalists marched through, crossing the Green Fork with drums echoing off the cold stone towers. Rob rode at the head, Grey Wind stalking with regal posture, and Rosalind Frystark, newly Queen of the North, was carried in a wheelhouse behind them, guarded by a small retinue of her kin. In the days that followed, the host advanced deeper into the Riverlands. They passed burned villages, the remains of once proud farmlands, all ravaged by the countless raids and skirmishes that had scarred the land since the War of the Five Kings began. Refugees, heads hung low, trudged along the roads to nowhere in particular. Some recognized the king in the north and fell to their knees, calling out for help. With each site of ruin, Robb's determination hardened. The war had wrought enough devastation. He longed to finish it, but finishing the war meant outmaneuvering the cunning Tywin Lannister and dealing with the other powers swirling around the Iron Throne. Stannis at Dragonstone, Balon Greyjoy in the Iron Islands, and even Renly's ghosts among the Reach Lords. The game was complicated and the board was vast. Small victories came. Bolton's men and Karstark outriders captured a Lannister scouting party near a burned September. Under interrogation, the scouts revealed that Tywin's forces were stretched thin, with many encamped at Harrenhal under Gregor Clegane. Another contingent had ridden with Tywin to King's Landing to shore up defenses there. Perhaps, the scouts suggested under duress, a lightning strike at Harrenhal might rout the Lannisters from the Riverlands entirely. Robb's council debated this vigorously. Harrenhal was a cursed place, enormous and foreboding, easy to defend if the defenders were well stocked, but also prone to betrayal and desertion. Who truly held Harrenhal these days might change in a span of weeks or days. In the end, spurred by a desire to cut out the heart of Lannister might in the Riverlands, Robb decided to strike. The king in the north marched quickly, forgoing the usual slow pace of supply wagons. They left a portion of their baggage behind, guarded by a skeleton detachment. This, Robb thought, might allow them to arrive at Harrenhal before Tywin could dispatch reinforcements. The river lords who accompanied them knew hidden trails and lesser-known paths. Lord Edmure Tully agreed to harry any Lannister outriders that threatened to slow them down. En route, Robb found moments to steal away with Roslyn. Though initially their marriage was little more than a political union, she slowly revealed a gentle nature, fond of music, less fond of her father's tyranny, and entirely in awe of the fact that she was now queen to a people she had never visited. Robb listened carefully, managing a small measure of warmth for his bride. She, in turn, began to ease her timidity, though the specter of war shadowed every conversation. In some corners of the camp, men grumbled that they had expected Robb to wed a grander figure, or that the Freys were not to be trusted. But the wedding vow was done, and the Freys, so far, had acted according to the new arrangement. Robb felt some relief at having navigated one potential catastrophe. The approach to Harrenhal was full of caution. Enormous spires and half-ruined towers jutted against the horizon. Smoke coiled from behind the blackened walls. Robb dispatched scouts who reported that the mountain, Gregor Clegane, had a significant force within, but their morale seemed low, and supplies might be dwindling. The fortress could withstand a siege, but the men inside, used to terrorizing peasants and small garrisons, might not put up the staunchest defense against a large, united host. Thus, on a clear dawn, Robb's forces arranged themselves before the black walls of Harrenhal. Northern outriders circled the perimeter, capturing any messenger ravens that tried to flee. Frey men under Ryman and Black Walder, two of Walder Frey's more warlike offspring, led siege crews alongside Stark engineers. Edmure Tully directed a contingent of archers on the western flank. Trumpets sounded, and banners fluttered in the rising sun. Gray winds howl carried across the plain. Within the fortress, horns answered, deeper and more ominous. Gregor Clegane's men braced for an assault, but Robb had learned from his mistakes. He would not rush headlong as he had in some earlier engagements. His plan was to test the walls for weaknesses while forging alliances with any potential turncoats inside the castle. Harrenhal had seen a succession of rulers in a short span. The Lannisters, then Roose Bolton, then back to the Lannisters, each leaving behind pockets of discontent. A few men inside might be swayed if the right inducement was offered. Scouts discovered a drain leading into the castle, though it was rumored to be closely guarded. Still, if a small group could infiltrate, they might open one of the gates from within. A classic tactic, but dangerous. Nonetheless, time pressed, and Tywin Lannister was not idle. Bolton offered to coordinate the infiltration. He was methodical, cunning, and adept at deception. In the gloom of the command tent, Robb considered sending him. He was not entirely comfortable placing that much trust in the Dreadfort Lord, but Roose Bolton's talents made him indispensable. Besides, if Bolton succeeded, the castle might fall with minimal casualties. Under cover of darkness, Bolton led a small force of picked men, silent killers, men of shadow, who managed to slip into the drain and overpower the guards. Before dawn, the main gate of Harrenhal groaned open. All at once, Northmen and rivermen poured in, flinging torches and brandishing steel. The fortress erupted into battle cries, the clang of swords, the shriek of the dying. Gregor Clegane's men, caught half-armed and sleepy, fought back with savage desperation. The Mountain himself was said to be unstoppable, cutting down men left and right with that monstrous greatsword. Robb advanced with a wedge of his best knights, shield on his arm, sword at the ready, Grey Wind bounding beside him, fangs bared. In the chaos, he caught glimpses of men in black mail, the swirling Tully trout on surcoats, the leaping direwolf standard. Firelight danced on the wet, smoky stones. Crossbow bolts hissed overhead, and from the ramparts above, Lannister archers tried to coordinate. The courtyard was a chaotic swirl of bodies. Somewhere near the battered stables, Gregor Clegane roared. Robb saw the hulking figure in the near distance, a black tower of armor, hammering men aside as if they were straw. In a frenzy, the Mountain smashed a Northman's helm into a pulp, then turned to face the oncoming knights. Robb's own men hesitated. The sight of this inhuman giant was enough to quell the bravest hearts, for his legend was known across the realm. Yet fear alone would not serve. Robb pressed forward. If the Great John was here, the two might have tried to overwhelm the Mountain with sheer brute force, but the Great John was at another part of the line. So Robb steeled himself. Grey Wind snarled, hackles raised. In that moment, a volley of arrows arced down from the ramparts, striking the courtyard. One arrow lodged in the weak point of Gregor's armor near his neck. He roared with pain. Another arrow found his thigh. He tore them out with savage fury, but the onslaught allowed Robb's men to surge forth. A half-dozen swords and spears battered at Gregor's flanks. At last, with a mighty thrust of a spear into his shoulder, the hulking figure staggered. Then Grey Wind leapt, jaws clamping on the Mountain's unprotected face. Gregor toppled backward with a guttural scream. The direwolf's fangs tore at flesh. By the time Grey Wind sprang aside, Gregor Clegane was no longer rising. It was not a single knight's glory that day, but a combined effort. Archers, spearmen, and a direwolf all took down the Mountain. The courtyard erupted into cheers among the Northmen. Some of the Lannister men, seeing their champion fall, broke ranks and fled. Others fought on, but pockets of resistance were cut down. Soon, the fighting ebbed. The gates were firmly in Stark hands. The king in the north stood victorious in the courtyard, breathing heavily, face grim with the knowledge that yet more men had died on both sides. Yet Harrenhal was his, and the Lannister presence in the Riverlands was diminished. News of Gregor Clegane's death traveled fast. The Mountain, undone at last, fueled stories of the king in the North's prowess. Rumors spread that Robb himself had faced him down and slew him in single combat, though that was more myth than fact. The effect on morale, however, was undeniable. Harrenhal was a great prize. Robb placed some of his loyal men, along with men from House Frey, to garrison it. Though the Freys bickered among themselves, they recognized the significance of controlling such a strong fortress. That done, Robb reorganized his host. If Tywin was still tied up in King's Landing, perhaps the way was open for a bold thrust into the Westerlands. Even so, the notion troubled him. Winter was coming, as the old Stark words reminded him. Sustaining a prolonged invasion might overextend his forces. In a council within Harrenhal's grand but haunted hall, with its massive hearths and blackened walls, Robb discussed strategies with his lords. Roose Bolton proposed striking at the fords to ensure no Lannister relief force could retake Harrenhal. Lord Karstark demanded vengeance for his slain sons, pushing to storm Casterly Rock itself if it meant crushing the Lannisters for good. Edmure Tully suggested a more defensive approach: solidify the Riverlands, push the Lannisters entirely out, then perhaps broker alliances with the Vale or Stormlands. Meanwhile, representatives from Walder Frey pointed out that the Frey crossing was still essential, and they deserved consideration in all plans. At the table, tension simmered. This was the challenge of leading multiple great houses in war. Appease them, keep them united, and still guide them toward victory. Robb's youth might have counted against him, but the men had witnessed his string of triumphs that carried weight. In the end, they decided to secure the Riverlands more thoroughly before making any ambitious moves west. Already, word was that King's Landing was in turmoil. Stannis Baratheon might soon march again, or the Tyrells might throw their weight behind one cause or another. The unstoppable Tywin Lannister was pinned in the capital. If the king in the north seized control of the Riverlands for good, he might then negotiate a favorable settlement or, if it came to it, push into the Westerlands from a position of strength. Let the Lannisters come to him on the battlefield of his choosing. The weeks that followed were a slow grind of lesser battles and skirmishes. Roose Bolton took a cavalry detachment north to free some scattered pockets of Northmen from Lannister or Ironborn raids. The king in the north summoned the strength of newly reconciled Riverlords, who, seeing Harrenhal under Stark control, felt emboldened. They recaptured smallholds, crossing points, and outposts. The Freys grudgingly contributed some forces, though always insisting on rewards for each success. Robb grew weary of their demands but knew he had locked himself to that fractious house. On occasion, Lady Rosslyn quietly offered to speak to her kin, perhaps smooth over some arguments. Robb, awkward as it was, encouraged her to do so. He found she had a talent for quelling her siblings' rivalries. Sometimes, a gentle word from her was enough to calm them. That development surprised Robb. He was slowly learning the value of a kind and perceptive partner, even if theirs had not been a love match. As the dust of war settled in some corners of the Riverlands, news filtered in from beyond. Word reached them that Balon Greyjoy had been thrown from a rope bridge at Pike, rumored to be the work of the Faceless Men or perhaps dark magic. Euron Greyjoy had taken the Seastone chair, and there was talk of him building strange ships. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, King Joffrey reigned under the iron hand of the Lannisters and their allies, but rumors said that Tyrion Lannister was out of favor, that Queen Cersei was locked in power struggles with the Tyrells. Some said Margaery Tyrell had arrived to wed Joffrey, forging an alliance between the Reach and the Crown. The War of the Five Kings was shifting again, new fault lines opening. Robb had to stand ready. Amid these uncertainties, life continued behind the blackened walls of Harrenhal. The nights were rife with ghost stories of Harren and his sons. Soldiers swore they heard wailing voices in the corridors, or glimpsed apparitions in the ruinous towers. Despite such rumors, Robb used the castle's imposing presence to host visiting bannermen, forging new bonds. He frequently rode out to personally oversee local security, riding beneath the Stark banner with Grey Wind at his side. In these endeavors, Rosslyn accompanied him from time to time, a presence that often softened the hearts of local peasants who might otherwise have feared a conquering host. She seemed frightened of the horrors of war, but she persevered in an unassuming, quiet way, winning small measures of loyalty wherever she went. The impetus to strike again came sooner than Robb expected. A raven from the south brought news that Lord Tywin was on the move, perhaps heading toward Harrenhal to reclaim it or cut it off. Another letter arrived from the Vale, from Lady Lysa Arryn, who wrote something vague and self-serving about considering an alliance with the king in the north if certain concessions were met. She wanted the security of her own domain above all, but might be persuaded to send the Knights of the Vale into the fray. The letter was as frosty as expected. Lady Lysa did not forget that Robb was nephew to Catelyn Tully, and yet she offered no immediate promise of support. Still, it was a crack in the door, and a potential second front that might keep the Lannisters at bay. Robb convened his war council again. Edmure Tully pressed for a direct confrontation with Tywin near the Blackwater if the Lannisters tried to cross. Karstark wanted to draw Tywin out and ambush him. The Freys wanted to ensure that the crossing at the Twins remained protected at all costs. Roose Bolton, subtle as ever, suggested letting Tywin come to Harrenhal, then slipping behind him to sever his supply lines. Let him starve outside the cursed fortress. Robb weighed each argument carefully, longing for his mother's counsel, though she was still traveling on a separate mission to treat with Renly or gather intelligence about Sansa and Arya's fate. They had no word of the Stark girls in King's Landing of late, Only rumors that Sansa was betrothed to Joffrey, a marriage that might or might not occur depending on the crown's whim, and no confirmed sightings of Arya at all. "Let Tywin come," Robb finally said, voice echoing in the great chamber. "If he wants Harrenhal back, he can try to take it. We'll prepare the fortress, we'll stockpile food, and we'll set up outposts along every approach. I want him blind. I want him uncertain of our real numbers." They set to work. Engineers repaired walls and reinforced gates. Caches of arrows were stocked, and half-burned structures were cleared to give archers clear lines of sight. Scouts patrolled the roads, watching for any sign of Lannister outriders. The men waited, tension coiled, for the march of Tywin's formidable host. In the camp, some men gambled by firelight, telling stories of the unstoppable Tywin Lannister and how he once bested the Reynes and Tarbecks. Others expressed confidence that the king in the north had never lost a major engagement to Tywin. Few realized how precarious war could be, how a single day's ill turn might break an entire campaign. In the midst of all these preparations, a rider arrived from the north, House Umber's colors flying. He brought dire news. The Ironborn under Euron Greyjoy were still harassing the northern coasts. Moat Cailin was in danger, threatened by a combined strike from Iron Men who had sailed around, making alliances with rebellious hill tribes. The letter contained pleas for the king in the north to return and secure his homeland. Robb read the message with mounting distress. He had left the north vulnerable when he marched south to avenge his father and free the Riverlands from the Lannisters. Had the price of that victory been the slow ruination of the north by an Ironborn incursion? He called another council. Lords who had grown used to looking south were startled to hear of troubles so far north. Lord Karstark raged that they must defend their homeland first. The River Lords, however, insisted that the real war was here, that leaving would cede ground to Tywin. The Freys worried about how a divided force would affect their own position. Roose Bolton, calm and unnerving, said that if the king left the Riverlands for the north, the Lannisters would be emboldened. But if he did not, the north might be lost. Painful choice indeed. In the end, Robb decided to divide his forces. He would lead a part of the host north to secure Moat Cailin and quell the Ironborn threat, leaving command at Harrenhal in the hands of Roose Bolton and Edmure Tully. House Frey's contingent would remain at the Twins, forming a bulwark against any Lannister approach from that side, or so that was the plan. Though it pained him to trust Bolton, the man had proven his cunning and leadership abilities. Edmure Tully would help balance him out, hopefully ensuring no ill luck befell Harrenhal in the king's absence. Robb left Rosslyn at Harrenhal, deciding she would be safer there than traveling through war-torn lands. She accepted his decision, though her eyes were filled with worry. She had begun to form something akin to fondness for her stern yet fair husband, and she felt apprehension at being left in a place of horror. Still, there were ladies among the Tully bannermen for companionship, and the Frey presence, in theory, would keep her safe. The parting was subdued. Robb kissed her hand and promised to return. Grey Wind lingered near her briefly, sniffing at her gown, then padded after Robb. The king in the north led his chosen men back across the Riverlands, heading for Moat Cailin. The journey north was grueling. They recrossed the Twins, where Walder Frey, now Robb's father-in-law, crowed about the success of the Union and demanded to know how many men Robb would leave to guard his dear crossing. Robb had little patience for Walder's self-serving commentary, but he placated the old man with a small detachment. Lord Walder fussed over the minimal number, but Robb insisted his main host was needed to reclaim the north. The crossing had to remain open, yes, but the king's domain took precedence. Walder's glare was sharp. Robb pressed on. Through the neck, the land turned boggy and treacherous. Reed folk allied with House Reed greeted them in the marshes. Howland Reed's children, Mira and Jojen, were rumored to roam the north, searching for the lost Bran and Rickon, or so the story went. Robb grieved the memory of his younger brothers, uncertain if they were safe or alive. The Reeds who met him gave no firm news, only vague tidings that the two Stark boys had escaped Winterfell before the Ironborn burned it. They might be somewhere beyond the wall or hidden in the wilderness. Robb held on to that hope. The war had so many casualties, Ned, the countless nameless soldiers, and perhaps even the old ways of the North. He could not bear to add his little brothers to that toll. At Moat Cailin, the carnage was evident. Ironborn raiders had erected pikes with heads of northerners outside the ruin. The proud fortress that once guarded the causeway to the north had crumbled in places, battered by siege or sabotage. Within the muddy courtyard, a reek of decay permeated. The Ironborn, more raiders than a disciplined army, had left only a small garrison behind, but they had made that garrison formidable by the vantage they controlled. Their longships patrolled the waters along the marshy edges, harrying any approach. Yet they had not counted on the full might of the king in the north. Robb's host was not as large as it had been. He had to leave many behind, but it was still formidable. In a swift surprise attack at dawn, the northern cavalry and foot advanced on multiple sides, while archers rained arrows from higher ground. Grey Wind's howls led the charge. The Ironborn, trapped within the crumbling walls, tried to hold them off with throwing axes and crossbows, but the Northmen's fury was unstoppable. Soon the courtyard was red with blood. Moat Cailin was reclaimed, though battered. Victory came at a cost. Many good men had perished. Lord Karstark's grief-laden eyes reminded Robb of the father's vengeance that was yet unpaid. Karstark still yearned to take Jaime Lannister's head for the deaths of his sons. But Jaime was rumored to be in King's Landing, or traveling with Brienne of Tarth under some arrangement Catelyn Stark had once made. The complexities weighed on Robb's mind. Still, Moat Cailin's recapture was a significant step in securing the north. Perhaps the Ironborn would retreat further if word spread that the king in the north had returned. Robb established a garrison at Moat Cailin. Next, he pressed onward, seeking to retake the major northern strongholds from the Ironborn. Many among the Ironborn had deserted after Balon Greyjoy's death, leaving pockets of chaos in places like Torrhen Square and Deepwood Motte. The rumors of Euron's new ambitions further west gave Robb a chance. If he moved swiftly, he could rid the north of these scattered raiders. And move swiftly he did. The next few weeks were a harsh campaign of quick strikes and forced marches, retaking lightly held strongholds one by one. Everywhere he went, the Northmen rallied to him. Lord Manderly's men from White Harbor joined, bringing with them supplies and fresh levies. Soon, the king in the north had re-established a measure of order across much of his homeland, though heavy snows threatened as the seasons crept on. Winter was indeed looming, and the land would not easily feed large armies. Throughout these efforts, the letters from the south told of Tywin Lannister indeed marching on Harrenhal, only to find it heavily fortified. Roose Bolton reported skirmishes and feints around the fortress, but no grand assault. Edmure Tully's men disrupted Tywin's supply lines. The infamous Red Wedding, that monstrous event of betrayal, never came to pass because Robb had not dishonored his pact. Without that personal slight, Walder Frey had no reason to collaborate with Tywin and Roose in a scheme of revenge. So Tywin was forced to rely on open warfare. For a moment, the winds of war seemed to favor the north. Yet Tywin Lannister did not earn his reputation by chance. He might still have cards to play. Robb spent a rare quiet evening at Winterfell's ruins. Standing among the blackened stones of his ancestral home, his mind churned with memories. Running through the courtyard with Bran, sparring with Jon under the watchful eye of Ser Roderick Castle, listening to Ned's words of honor. The castle was gutted. The Ironborn under Theon had taken it, then lost it, leaving a trail of destruction. Now it stood as a symbol of what had been lost. Robb walked through the rubble, Grey Wind silent at his side, as if the direwolf too felt the ghosts of the past. Slowly, the king in the north resolved to rebuild. The seeds of the future had to be planted here, at home, even if war still raged beyond the neck. He knelt in the godswood, or what remained of it, before the weirwood tree. Though many trees had burned, the heart tree still stood. Leaves as red as blood, bark white as bone, its carved face weeping sap tears. There, Robb whispered words to his father's spirit, to the old gods, to the memory of Winterfell's unbroken line. He prayed for guidance, for the strength to protect the north and see the war to a just conclusion. When he rose, the burden on his heart felt a fraction lighter. Grey Wind gazed at him with knowing eyes. The next day brought dire news again. Tywin had apparently broken off from Harrenhal and marched south in a hurry. One rumor claimed that Stannis Baratheon was threatening King's Landing anew, forcing Tywin to choose between retaking Harrenhal or saving the capital. Another rumor suggested that Tywin had formed a new alliance with House Tyrell, and with Marjorie's upcoming marriage to King Joffrey, the Lannister host might expand tenfold with fresh reach levies. The uncertain swirl of politics was not easily parsed from hundreds of miles away. Robb decided that, with the north mostly cleared of immediate threats, he must rejoin his army at Harrenhal to ensure that no disaster befell his Riverlands campaign. Lord Bolton's letters were thorough but not entirely comforting. Something in the subtext disturbed Robb, for Bolton mentioned the potential for an advantageous alliance with the Lannisters, though couched in disclaimers. Robb disliked the very idea, but he recognized Bolton's cunning mind might see possibilities where others saw only foes. Leaving most of the northern lords to rebuild and defend against further Ironborn raids, Robb took a core force of loyal men south again. The roads were colder now, snow drifting in occasional flurries, turning the land into a patchwork of white and brown. They pressed down the causeway, once more crossing the neck, forging through the swamps. By the time they reached the Twins, the freed crossing welcomed them. Walder Frey greeted Robb's return with self-congratulatory remarks. "Ah, you're still living? And so is my Rosslyn, I hope? Good. Robb tried to keep his disdain in check, reminding himself that Walder had not betrayed them. The old man pressed for news of the north and demanded details about how the Ironborn had been driven out. Robb gave short answers. His real concern was reaching Harrenhal and verifying the state of the war. Soon, the king in the north arrived back at the blackened fortress he had left in Bolton's care. He found the outer defenses intact, though the mood among the garrison was tense. Inside the cold halls, torches flickered, revealing gaunt faces of men who had been on the edge of battle for too long. Edmure Tully greeted Robb with open relief, though there was a strain in his expression. "My king, Tywin never attempted a full assault, only skirmishes. Then he turned south, likely to respond to some threat near the capital. But we have been penned up here, waiting for his return, not knowing which direction the next blow would come from." Roose Bolton appeared as well, bowing smoothly. "Your Grace, the Lannisters remain cunning. They tested our walls, burned some outposts, but never offered a decisive battle. They have marched south now. If they succeed in forging that alliance with Highgarden, they may come north again, stronger than before." Robb absorbed the reports. He noticed that Lady Rosslyn stood to the side, unharmed but visibly wan. When she caught his eye, she managed a small, genuine smile. Quietly, she confided that being here without him was unnerving, but she had done what she could. Robb thanked her in hushed tones. Now the question loomed. Should Robb attempt to pursue Tywin south and strike him before the union with the Tyrells was cemented, or remain in the Riverlands, entrenching Harrenhal, Riverrun, and the Twins as a formidable defensive line? A bold offensive might catch Tywin unprepared, or it might lead the Northmen into a trap on southern ground. Robb's council was divided. Lord Karstark, unwavering, insisted that only Lannister blood would avenge his sons. Edmure Tully was wary of overextending. Bolton once again suggested a cunning approach. Let Tywin exhaust himself in other battles, then pick him off. The Frey envoys bickered about the safety of the Twins. Meanwhile, Robb felt the weight of being a king heavier than ever. The war had spanned years now. The longer it dragged on, the more the small folk suffered. The Lannisters still held Sansa, perhaps Arya too, though no word of her had reached him. Each day, the realm fractured further. Finally, after many nights of debate, Robb issued a measured command. Harrenhal would remain garrisoned, but Edmure Tully and most of the Riverlords would remain in the Riverlands, securing every crossing, every fortress, ensuring Tywin could not slip behind them. Robb would lead a contingent south along the King's Road, aiming to rendezvous with potential allies, perhaps House Tyrell's enemies or bandit groups that hated the Lannisters. He would keep his numbers tight enough to move fast, hoping to strike at any vulnerable Lannister forces or to negotiate Sansa's release if the opportunity arose. This was not the ideal plan, but none were. The war was as much a labyrinth as a battlefield. Rosalind surprisingly asked to accompany him. Harrenhal wore on her spirits, she confessed. She worried for her king, and she believed her presence might ease negotiations if they encountered lords who distrusted the Starks but had no particular quarrel with the Freys. Robb considered the idea. Though having his wife along might slow certain operations and cause concern for her safety, he also saw the value in presenting a united front, a king in the north who honored his alliances. In the end, with some reluctance, he agreed. She would ride with him, though guarded at all times. So the king in the north set forth once more, traveling in a lean, mobile war party. With him rode the most loyal northern bannermen. The Great Jon, Lord Karstark, still cold with vengeance, Rickard Ryswell, the Mormonts, and a contingent of riders. Roose Bolton, ironically, remained behind with Edmure Tully at Harrenhal to guard the main body of the host. Bolton had lightly pressed to accompany the king, but Robb had refused, uneasy with the man's presence near Rosalind and uncertain about Bolton's ambitions. If betrayal was to come, better to keep it at a distance where it could not harm the entire leadership. The king in the north parted with them politely, exchanging the courtesies expected of allies, yet bearing in mind that he must watch Bolton's actions carefully. They moved south, crossing the wide plains of the Riverlands that were slowly recovering from the scars of war. Small folk emerged from hiding to see the king in the north ride by, some cheering, others just staring warily. They camped near a burned septri, where silent sisters passed by, transporting the remains of men who had fallen in various battles. Winter kept threatening an early arrival, with cold snaps at night and frost that coated tents by dawn. Rosalind bore the harsh travel with surprising resilience. She rarely complained, though Robb noticed she shivered in her furs and sometimes looked afraid when they passed through places where battles had raged. He found himself offering small comforts, a warm cloak, a gentle word. Their marriage might have been political, but they were forging a bond in shared hardship, and that was not nothing. Scouts brought word that Tywin's army was near the Blackwater once again, and that King's Landing was preparing a great spectacle, King Joffrey's wedding to Margaery Tyrell. The Watchers predicted that after the wedding, Tywin would have the full might of Highgarden at his disposal. The Reach was vast and populous, able to field enormous armies. The Tyrells had gold, grain, and an entrenched network of alliances. If Tywin harnessed that strength, the Lannisters would become an overwhelming force. Robb weighed these tidings. Perhaps, if fortune favored him, the tensions between the Lannisters and Tyrells would erupt, giving him time to strike or to press for better terms for the North's independence. War was not merely a series of battles, but a tapestry of intrigue and fleeting opportunities. As they drew closer to the edge of the Crownlands, caution increased tenfold. Patrols of Lannister soldiers roamed the roads. The gold and red banners of House Lannister, combined with the stag and lion sigil of King Joffrey, appeared in the distance. Robb's party avoided large confrontations, using lesser-known roads and traveling by night. They gleaned what information they could from peasants. The capital was bustling with new arrivals from the Reach, pavilions set up for a grand wedding. Tension crackled in the air. The name Stannis Baratheon was whispered, though no one could confirm if the man planned an assault on the city. One dusk, Robb's host made camp in a sparse wood near a slow-moving river. The Great Jon claimed an outcropping to pitch his tent. Karstark's men took the perimeter. Rosalind had a small pavilion, guarded by a half-dozen loyal knights. Robb took a moment to rest beneath an oak tree, watching the last rays of light filter through the branches. Grey Wind sat close by, ears twitching at every forest sound. The War of the Five Kings had raged so long, and yet the end was not in sight. Still, he was alive. His men were loyal, and the Red Wedding, that unthinkable betrayal, had been averted the day he chose to honor his word to House Frey. If only the rest of this war could be solved by a single choice of honor, Robb thought. He prayed for his sisters, uncertain of their fates. He prayed for his mother, out there somewhere trying to forge alliances or rescue her daughters. He prayed for the memory of his father and for the future of the North. Above all, he prayed for wisdom, for each choice seemed more fraught than the last. Then he rose, banishing weariness. A king cannot yield to despair. Morning broke with news. A band of Lannister outriders was spotted in a nearby village, possibly on the hunt for bandits or rebels. Robb quickly mustered a small force to intercept them. Stealth was paramount. The Northmen moved through dense copses, splitting into two groups to flank the village from different sides. The outriders, about 30 in number, were easily outmatched by Robb's nearly 100 men, but these were no mere peasants. They wore the lion's sigil proudly, suggesting they served a higher-ranking commander. If they escaped, they might alert the main Lannister army. A brief skirmish erupted. The Great Jon charged in with a roaring laugh, brandishing his massive sword, while Karstark led a flanking move that cut off the outriders' retreat. Grey Wind darted among the horses, causing confusion. Within minutes, most of the Lannisters lay dead or captured. One outrider, wounded, was taken prisoner. They questioned him, pressing for information about Tywin's plans. The man spat curses but, under the glint of steel, confessed that Tywin was indeed in King's Landing for the royal wedding, though he remained ready to march north the moment it concluded. The Tyrells were bringing tens of thousands of men. "You're doomed," the man sneered. "Highgarden's might is unmatched. Soon you'll see a wave of spears that will drown you in blood." Robb considered the prisoner's words. Perhaps the man exaggerated, but House Tyrell's resources were indeed vast. The Great Jon laughed, claiming that all the gold in Casterly Rock would not save the Lannisters from Northern Steel. But inwardly, Robb worried. A direct confrontation with the combined Lannister-Tyrell host would be suicidal. They needed a different approach. Could they strike a deal with the Tyrells? Hard to imagine, with Margaery set to marry Joffrey. Could they reach out to Stannis, forging an alliance against the Lannisters that might partition the realm? Or would that deliver the North from one conqueror to another? Returning to camp, Robb tried to piece together a plan. Lady Rosslyn, hearing of the prisoner's testimony, asked if negotiation was truly impossible. "There must be some who resent the Lannisters even among the Tyrells," she said softly. "Perhaps you can speak to them." Robb was unsure. Catelyn had once tried to negotiate with Renly, but his untimely death shattered that possibility. Still, Rosslyn's quiet optimism nudged him to consider that not everyone in Highgarden's orbit was thrilled with an alliance to Joffrey. Many lords might chafe under Lannister rule. If only the king in the north could find the right lever. His scouts informed him that the King's Road was swarming with Lannister patrols. To approach King's Landing openly would be reckless. But an opportunity arose when a merchant caravan, heading to the capital with supplies for the wedding, came upon Robb's camp by chance. Fearing for their lives, the merchants hastily proclaimed loyalty to King Joffrey, but they had no desire to see their goods seized or themselves killed. They might be persuaded to cooperate in smuggling a small group into the outskirts of the city, hidden among barrels of grain or casks of wine meant for the wedding feast. It was a mad plan, but perhaps the only way to glean real intelligence about the enemy's intentions without risking the entire host in a direct confrontation. Robb considered going himself, but his lords vehemently objected. A king could not risk captivity or death so rashly. Instead, he decided to send a trusted envoy, someone who could blend in, gather information, and maybe make contact with any disaffected lords. A few men volunteered. In the end, Robb chose Lord Galbart Glover, a man of cunning and composure, with a small retinue of 3, including a maester who could read and write swiftly. They would disguise themselves as hired guards for the merchant caravan. If they were caught, the king in the north would disavow them. It was a dangerous mission, but Glover accepted without hesitation, pledging his life to the cause. Within a day, Glover and his men set forth, hidden among the merchants' wagons. Robb prayed to the old gods for their success. Meanwhile, he moved his camp to a more secluded location, avoiding the main roads, relying on scouts and outriders for supplies and information. At night, he and Rosslyn spoke quietly in their tent, discussing the future of the war, the north, and what might happen if Sansa was still imprisoned at court. Rosalind admitted she had never met Sansa, but as a fellow young woman, she could imagine the terror of being held at the mercy of the Lannisters. Robb appreciated her empathy. He told her of Sansa's gentleness, her love of songs and stories, which ironically had led her straight into the Viper's nest. Days turned into a tense wait. Occasionally, they ambushed small Lannister patrols or avoided them. Winter's approach made travel more difficult. The crisp morning air stung their faces. Finally, after nearly a fortnight, one of Glover's men returned, half-frozen, riding an exhausted horse. The man bore a letter and recounted all he had seen. King's Landing was indeed in the midst of wedding preparations. The Tyrells arrived in force, their banners filling the streets, their knights showing off their flowered sigils. The city swelled with commoners seeking bread and amusements. Rumors flew about a lavish feast, about golden roses and exotic displays. Tywin Lannister was at the height of his power, orchestrating the alliance that would keep the Iron Throne secure. But behind the splendor, the man reported, there were whispers of tensions between the Lannisters and Tyrells. A faction among the Reach Lords resented the marriage, thinking Marjorie should be wed to a more worthy king, or that the Lannisters were unscrupulous schemers. Still, most seemed determined to proceed. The wedding was imminent. Once it concluded, the Tyrell armies, by arrangement, were to march north with Tywin to quash the Starks once and for all. The letter from Galbart Glover provided more details. Joffrey's wedding day was set, and shortly thereafter, a massive host would muster in the Crownlands, with Mace Tyrell personally overseeing the supply lines. If the North did not act, they would be outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. Robb read the letter in silence. The Great John cursed. Karstark's eyes burned. Rosalind looked pale. An overwhelming force. If Robb tried to gather every Northman and Riverlord to fight, the Lannisters and Tyrells might still crush them. A direct confrontation was suicide. They needed a cunning plan. Some suggested trying to assassinate Joffrey during the wedding, sowing chaos. Robb dismissed that. Murdering a king at his wedding would lead to an even fiercer crackdown, and it was no guarantee of success. Others proposed forging an alliance with Stannis, if he was still out there, uniting to attack King's Landing at the same time, hoping to catch the Tyrells between two fronts. But they had no sure way to reach Stannis or ensure he would trust the Starks. The memories of Robert's rebellion held weight, but that was long ago. As they deliberated, more news came. The wedding had occurred. King Joffrey was said to have died at the feast, choking on his wine. Marjorie Tyrell was left a widow before the bedding even took place. Panic swept the city. Some suspected poison, others black magic. Tywin Lannister accused Tyrion Lannister, who was arrested. Chaos reigned. Mace Tyrell demanded justice. The Lannister-Tyrell alliance strained. People said the new king would be Tommen, a boy even younger than Joffrey. The shape of the war changed in an instant. Tywin might hold the real power, but the Tyrells, outraged at Joffrey's death, might not be so eager to rush north. Or they might blame the Starks, though that seemed less likely. The real question was how Tywin would proceed. Without Joffrey, the Lannisters had lost a figurehead, but Tywin still commanded. Seizing the opportunity, Robb recognized that the Iron Throne was again in tumult. The city was in disarray, with key players turning on each other. The Tyrells might use this opportunity to push for more concessions. Perhaps the marriage alliance would hold, or perhaps not. If the Tyrells broke with the Lannisters, the balance of power would shift drastically. The king in the north smelled an opportunity for negotiation or advantage. He ordered his men to break camp and move closer to the Crownlands, not to attack, but to stand ready. A well-placed messenger might find a Tyrell lord who would prefer to make common cause with the Starks, or at least remain neutral, rather than continue an uncertain alliance in King's Landing. The Great John thought it madness, but he agreed that if the Tyrell alliance fell apart, the Lannisters might be forced to sue for peace. So the king in the north marched again, drifting closer to the heart of the Seven Kingdoms than any Stark host had been in living memory. Rosalind rode beside him, quiet yet resolute. Winter's chill laced the wind. Overhead, storm clouds gathered. The realm stood at a crossroads. A single choice, Robb Stark's decision to honor his pledge to the Freys, had diverted the fate that once led to the Red Wedding. Now, the Starks still stood, battered but unbroken, while the Lannisters faced new chaos in the capital. All that remained was to see which thread fate would spin next, in a world where war had become the new order, and peace a fleeting dream. They marched onward into that uncertain future, determined to claim their victory, or at least their survival, amid the shifting tides of alliances and betrayals, guided by the unyielding Northern creed. Winter is coming, and the North remembers. And as long as a Stark king rode beneath the direwolf banner, hope for a better tomorrow still flickered, as faint and persistent as the light of distant stars on the coldest, darkest night. Robb Stark led his contingent deeper into the Crownlands as winter's chill scoured the fields and forests. The wind came howling from the west, carrying the scent of distant snows. At every turn, the king in the north kept his column small and inconspicuous. This was not a triumphant advance. It was a wary infiltration of sorts, the kind of maneuver that required vigilance and secrecy. They marched at twilight and camped in shadowy groves, so that Lannister or Tyrell outriders would struggle to track them. Lady Rosslyn, wrapped in thick furs, rode in a covered wagon near the middle of the train. Sometimes she asked to dismount and walk beside Robb, holding the reins of a gentle mare, quietly matching her pace to the king's. He would allow it when the land was safe enough. In those rare private moments, they spoke in hushed tones about the swirl of events that had overtaken the realm. Sometimes Robb found himself amazed by her perseverance. Rosslyn Fry had never expected to become queen in the north. Now she found herself at her king's side, precariously close to the heart of Lannister power, in the middle of winter with everything they loved at stake. During these travels, the Great Jon led the van, lurching upon his charger with an eager grin. He was always the first to volunteer for a scouting foray or a brief skirmish against a roving band of brigands. Lord Karstark held a rearguard, grim and silent, his eyes forever burning with the memory of his fallen sons. A handful of other Northmen flanked the wagons. Robb knew this small host was vulnerable. If a large Lannister detachment happened upon them, they would be forced to flee or fight a desperate battle. Yet the news from King's Landing was too momentous to ignore. Joffrey was dead. Tommen was poised to be crowned king. Tyrion Lannister stood accused of regicide, and the Tyrell alliance teetered on uncertain ground. Opportunity beckoned in the midst of chaos, if Robb could seize it. Around them, villages lay quiet in the cold, with shutters closed and rooftops dusted by snow. Some were half-burned shells, courtesy of older battles. Others had been looted by any of the myriad forces that had come and gone in the war. Lannister troops, Baratheon loyalists, even robber knights wearing no lord's sigil. Now those who remained were either too fearful to show their faces or too desperate to beg any passing soldiers for bread. Whenever Robb's men met villagers, they tried not to appear as pillagers themselves. They offered a few coin for supplies, took only what they needed, and moved on. As the king in the north ventured closer to the beaten tracks leading from Rosby and Duskendale to King's Landing, his scouts multiplied their caution. Fires at camp were limited to the smallest, smokeless flickers. The men used briars or gullies for concealment. More than once, outriders reported that a large Lannister or Tyrell force had passed within a few miles of them. Each time, Robb ordered his company to hunker down, lying silent until the enemy columns were gone. Finally, a scout brought word that Galbart Glover awaited him in a hidden hollow near a small hamlet. Glover, who had braved King's Landing in disguise, had more to report. Robb rode there at once, taking only a small guard and leaving the larger portion of his men a mile away under Karstark's watchful eye. It was near dusk when he found Glover waiting near a dying fire, clothed in a mix of merchant's garb and battered leathers. The man looked worn but determined. At the sight of Robb, Glover bowed his head. "Your Grace," he began, once they were alone save for a few loyal watchers. "King's Landing is a hornet's nest." The wedding feast turned into a funeral for Joffrey. Cersei Lannister was half-mad with grief and fury. Tywin tried to keep control, but the city was rife with rumors of poison. The general assumption is that Tyrion Lannister and possibly Sansa Stark conspired to kill the king. Sansa? Robb said sharply, his heart pounding. She would never, unless they forced her hand somehow. But you heard this from many sources. He could scarcely imagine his gentle sister slipping poison into Joffrey's cup. But war changed everyone, and the Lannisters had offered her so little kindness. Glover shook his head. A rumor, Your Grace. People love rumors in King's Landing. Some say Sansa Stark vanished amid the chaos. Others claim she was whisked away by a knight in service to Lord Baelish, or that she used black magic. There is no certainty, but the official line from the Crown is that Tyrion Lannister is guilty. He's on trial, with Cersei demanding his head. Tommen has been crowned king, but it's obvious Tywin is the true power behind the throne. Robb's jaw clenched at the mention of Sansa possibly vanished. That could be good or ill. Good if she had found some route to freedom. Ill if she'd fallen into unknown hands. He prayed the old gods had guided her away from harm. But at least she was no longer openly a prisoner in the Red Keep. Galbart Glover continued. As for the Tyrells, Margaery Tyrell is now a widow who was never truly a wife. The House Tyrell men are furious over Joffrey's death. Some whisper that they see only Lannister treachery or madness in the capital. But Mace Tyrell still hopes to wed Margaery to Tommen, if the crown will have it. He wants that queenly crown for his daughter. And Tywin, as I see it, wants the Reach's might to remain aligned with the Iron Throne. I suspect they'll broker another marriage. The Tyrell troops remain near the city, though. They haven't yet marched north. They're waiting to see how these events shake out. Robb took all of this in. If the Tyrells renewed their alliance with the Lannisters by wedding Margaery to Tommen, the war might continue unabated, with a fresh wave of Tyrell spears supporting the Lion's banner. That was a prospect that made his stomach twist. Yet it seemed the cracks in the Lannister-Tyrell union were deeper than they might have been otherwise. Suspicion, anger, doubt. If there were lords among the Reach who disliked the Lannisters enough, perhaps they could be turned, or at least persuaded to remain neutral while the North fought for independence. Did you make contact with any Tyrell bannermen yourself? Robb asked. Glover nodded. Discreetly. Some lesser lords in the Tyrell contingent remember the horrors of Robert's rebellion, or have old grudges against the Lannisters. They're not eager to ride north in the dead of winter to fight. But I would not expect them to revolt against their liege lords. If you want to turn Highgarden itself, that would require more than whispers. Mace Tyrell might be receptive to a grand offer. Trade deals, southern independence from the Iron Throne, who can say? But forging that alliance would be delicate. Delicate indeed, Robb thought. Then Glover handed him a small roll of parchment. There is one more thing, Your Grace. A letter from a man who claims to represent Lord Peter Baelish. He says Baelish recently took possession of Harrenhal, by the king's decree, though that was only on paper. And now, with the chaos in King's Landing, Baelish has been dispatched to the Vale to woo Lady Lysa Arryn into the crown's fold. But apparently, this contact wanted you to know that Lord Baelish might be open to certain arrangements. Something about the friendship of the Tullus and the possibility of bringing the Vale's forces in on your side, if a suitable arrangement can be reached. Robb almost scoffed. Peter Baelish, known as Littlefinger, had been his father's subordinate on the small council, once upon a time. Now he was rumored to be a master of schemes, a man with 1,000 plots swirling around him like crows. Robb had no trust for such a man. Yet if Baelish was aiming for power in the Vale and had some claim on Harrenhal, perhaps he would attempt to gather all sides under his influence. The question was whether it would serve the North or only Baelish himself. Still, information was better than ignorance. He thanked Glover and told him to rest. Then Robb returned to camp, calling a brief council with the Great Jon, Karstark, and a few other lords. Rosalind sat quietly to the side, listening with wide eyes as Robb relayed Glover's news. The Great Jon let out a booming laugh at the mention of Joffrey's demise, claiming it was no less than the boy deserved. Karstark's expression was grim, but he was glad to hear Sansa might be free. If only they could confirm Arya's fate. No rumors from King's Landing had even mentioned her name. They debated the next move. One possibility was to remain hidden in the Crownlands, waiting for the Tyrell-Lannister alliance to fracture. Another was to retreat northward, consolidating their power and letting the southern lords devour each other. A third, more daring plan was to attempt direct negotiations with some Tyrell faction or even with Tywin Lannister himself, though that last suggestion outraged Karstark, who demanded no parley with the butcher of Ned Stark. Robb sat in silence for a time, sifting through each option. All seemed fraught with risk, but the war had taught him that victory sometimes went to the one who seized the moment of confusion. Eventually, he spoke. "We cannot vanish into the woodwork forever, nor can we return home and hope the war forgets us. Winterfell is in ruins. The Riverlands still suffer. If the Tyrells and Lannisters unite fully, they will bring a force to the neck eventually. We need an alliance, or we need to strike swiftly, while the Iron Throne wavers." Karstark gave a curt nod, though a glint in his eye betrayed his preference for any plan that offered him a chance at Lannister blood. The Great Jon slapped his knee. "Who do you mean to treat with, then? Mace Tyrell? That oaf is too proud by half, or so I hear." "Perhaps we do not need Mace himself," Robb said quietly. "Lord Glover says there are lesser lords in the Tyrell host who might prefer not to fight us. Or we might approach Marjorie's grandmother, Olenna Redwine. She is rumored to be the real mind behind the Tyrells. If she's angered by Lannister arrogance, she might at least hear us out." The Great Jon had never met the Queen of Thorns, but he had heard tales of her barbed wit. He guffawed. "Word is she skewers grown men with her tongue alone. Good luck if you cross her." A faint smile came to Robb's lips. "We have little to lose by trying. If that fails, we can reassess. But first, we need a messenger who can slip into the Tyrell camps near King's Landing." He glanced around. "I will not send you, Great Jon, for subtlety is not your gift. Karstark, you've no taste for diplomacy." Karstark grimaced, but he did not deny it. "Let me go," a quiet voice said from near the tent's edge. Rosalind had spoken. She looked both nervous and resolved. If this is truly a negotiation of alliances through marriage or dynastic advantage, a queen might have more luck speaking with the Tyrell women. "They won't view me as a threat. I can pass as a lady of a southern house more readily than a man-at-arms could. Perhaps I could request an audience with Lady Olenna or Lady Marjorie." Robb's initial reaction was alarm. Sending Rosalind among the Tyrells without protection seemed reckless, especially given that the Tyrell alliance with the Lannisters might place her in great danger. But he considered her reasoning. The Tyrells put great stock in the social graces of court. A gentle, courteous approach might open doors. And there was also the curious fact that Rosalind was a Frey, a house not traditionally beloved nor hated by the Tyrells. She could position herself as a concerned bride who wished to see the realm at peace. It might work. Still, sending her alone was unthinkable. Robb would have to pick an escort, a small one so as not to appear like a threat. After a moment's internal struggle, he turned to her. "You realize the danger?" She nodded, her cheeks pale. "I do, but I believe I can help. Let me do this, Robb." It was the first time she had used his name so plainly in front of his lords, and that gesture alone showed how far their marriage had traveled from a mere political pact. "We must try something bold to secure peace. If I am taken prisoner, well, I am less valuable than you. I am only a queen by marriage. But if I succeed, you might gain an ally you never expected." Her gentle words stirred something in him, respect, and perhaps affection. He looked at Karstark and the Great Jon, who both seemed uncertain but could not find any immediate counterargument. "Very well," Robb said. "You will not go alone. You'll have a guard of loyal men, but only a few. The rest of us will remain close enough to come for you if danger arises. But you must be cautious. The moment you sense betrayal, you send word, or you flee." Rosalind inclined her head solemnly. "Yes, Your Grace." In the days that followed, they crafted a plan. Rosalind would ride toward the outskirts of the Tyrell encampment, which lay along the Rose Road, near the Blackwater. She would be disguised as a minor lady of a lesser Riverlands house, though in truth, some recognized her face as the new queen in the north. Still, a cloak and hood might prevent the common soldiers from noticing. With her would go a small retinue, a pair of Northmen who could pass as her guards, a handmaiden for appearances, and a maester to speak as her advisor. They would request an audience with the Tyrell ladies, bearing a sealed letter from Robb that invited private talks to prevent needless bloodshed in a war that had already taken too many lives. The king in the north stationed the bulk of his men in the thick woods a few miles away, ready to respond should the Tyrells act in bad faith. The Great John was tasked with leading a cavalry rescue if needed. Karstark lurked on the flanks with his outriders, though his displeasure at a mission of diplomacy was clear. "Words are wind," he said to Robb. "We should crush them before they gather." "There are too many to crush," Robb replied sternly. "Even if we had all our northern lords, plus the Riverlands, the Tyrell host could outnumber us, and Tywin's cunning would do the rest. We must try a different path. We owe it to our people." Karstark said nothing, but the simmering rage in his eyes had not diminished. At dawn, Rosalind and her small retinue set off. Robb gave her a final embrace, murmuring, "Don't take any risks that aren't necessary. If this meeting goes poorly, retreat at once. I'd rather meet them in open battle than lose you to a trap." Her expression was resolute. "I'll be careful," she promised, and then she mounted her mare, cloak trailing over the saddle. The group disappeared over a gentle rise, heading south in the direction of the Tyrell war camp, with the bright sun at their backs. Robb felt a twinge of guilt and worry. He had sent his queen into the lion's den, or rather the rose's den, though roses had their thorns, especially the Tyrell variety. The hours crawled by. Robb had a vantage point on a low hill where he and a few others could see, at a great distance, the banners of the Tyrell army. Their green fields dotted with golden roses were easy to spot. Even from afar, the scale of that host was daunting. Thousands of soldiers, supply wagons, tents flapping in the winter wind. He glimpsed occasional flashes of the Golden Lion banners as well. Lannister men patrolled the perimeter, though they seemed focused primarily on watching the roads to the city, not the woods to the north. Towards midday, a messenger galloped back, one of Roslind's guards. He reported they had gained entry to the camp, quietly. The Tyrell house guards had hesitated, but once they saw the seal on Robb's letter and recognized that this was a small, unthreatening party, they passed word up the chain of command. Lady Rosalind was escorted to a large green pavilion, presumably belonging to a highborn lady. The guard had been told to wait outside. He had come back to inform Robb that so far all was calm, but Rosalind was in a private meeting with some Tyrell lady or other. The soldier wasn't certain which. Robb's tension did not ease. While it was good news that no immediate hostility had arisen, he well knew how quickly matters could turn sour. He dismissed the guard to rest and wait. The Great John was ready at all times, half lowered in the saddle, if a rescue became necessary. Karstark's outriders scouted the edges of the Tyrell camp, looking for any sign that a host might break off and ride north. Robb waited, pacing. Gray wind prowled at his side, the direwolf's eyes flicking to every shift of branches, every sound of cracking twigs. The day stretched on, cold and clouded, until the sun dipped westward. Well past nightfall, at last, there came the sound of horses. The pickets hailed a returning party. Robb's heart kicked in his chest. He strode to the edge of camp. Out of the darkness emerged Lady Rosalind, escorted by the same guard and the handmaiden. The small group looked tired but uninjured. Rosalind swung down from her saddle. Robb caught her as she stumbled, steadying her. "What happened?" he asked, voice tense. She looked up into his eyes, breath misting in the chill air. "They listened," she whispered. "They listened more than I expected." In the dim light of the camp's torches, Rosalind recounted her experience, while Robb and the assembled lords listened in rapt silence. The tent to which she'd been taken belonged to none other than Lady Olenna Tyrell, the fabled Queen of Thorns, and Marjorie Tyrell herself was present as well. The older woman had eyed Rosalind keenly, demanding to know her purpose. Rosalind presented the letter from Robb, explaining that the king in the north wished for a parley to prevent further bloodshed. She admitted her own role. A new queen, once part of a Frey alliance, anxious to avoid a war that would cause more deaths and ruin across the realm. Olenna Tyrell, according to Rosalind, had sipped her tea and asked pointed questions about Walder Frey's reliability, about Robb Stark's honor, about the situation in the north, about the Red Wedding rumor she had heard, though in that rumor, it was apparently said that Robb had broken his vow. News had traveled in twisted shapes. Rosalind calmly set the record straight. Robb had not broken his betrothal. The wedding between Stark and Frey had indeed occurred, so the twins were still aligned with the North. That piece of news seemed to interest Lady Olenna greatly. "Quite a different tune than the stories we heard," she had said. "And what of your father, that nasty old weasel?" Rosalind had carefully steered the conversation away from Walder Frey's personal failings, focusing instead on the possibility of forging a future that might benefit the Tyrells and the North alike. Olenna's questions were sharp, but there was no immediate hostility. Margaery, silent for a time, eventually asked in a quiet voice if Robb truly intended to separate the North from the Iron Throne. Rosalind said yes, that had been his cause from the outset. At that, Margaery had pressed her lips together. She said that her father, Mace Tyrell, remained in alliance with Tywin Lannister, but the alliance was strained. Joffrey's death had outraged and humiliated them. If the Lannisters intended to cast blame on the Tyrells, privately or publicly, then war could erupt between them. But so far, Tywin had tried to patch things up by suggesting Margaery marry Tommen, the new Boy King. "You must understand," Rosalind said, repeating Margaery's words. "The Tyrells are not a small house. Their resources are vast, and Mace Tyrell does not always see cunning plots around him. He wants the glory of having his daughter as queen, whoever the king may be. But Lady Olenna is more skeptical. She wonders if the Lannisters will remain true to their word. She wonders who truly orchestrated Joffrey's death. She suspects more cunning players are at work." She mentioned that scoundrel Littlefinger. "She asked me, in so many words, if the Tyrells could profit more by forging an accord with the Starks, or at least by remaining neutral." Rosalind paused to draw breath. Frost clung to the edges of her cloak. Robb took her hands, which felt like ice. "So, is she open to negotiating with us?" he asked. "Was that your sense?" Rosalind nodded. "Yes, though carefully," she said, and these were her words as best I recall. "If the young wolf thinks we'll cast aside years of alliances with Lannister gold on a whim, he's as green as grass. But if that alliance stands upon rotted supports, and if your king in the north can promise something more valuable than hollow crowns, then perhaps we can talk. Tell him to come with a small retinue near our lines in 3 days' time, and we'll see if words can turn the tide of war. Until then, keep your swords sheathed." Robb exhaled slowly. A meeting, an actual parley with the Tyrell matriarch, was more than he had hoped for so soon. It was also a risk. The Greyjohn's face was split in a wide grin. "That's a start, lad," he said, clapping Robb on the shoulder. "You always said you'd break the Lannisters by outmaneuvering them. Now you might do it without an arrow loosed." Karstark, by contrast, looked sullen. "We'll see. Tyrells can be as treacherous as the Lannisters. They might only be luring us in." Robb was well aware of that possibility, but he could not let fear paralyze him. "We have to try," he said. "I'll do as Lady Olenna requested. Arrive with a small retinue in 3 days. We'll choose a neutral patch of ground, maybe an open field near the Rose Road. Let them see we're not bringing an army, but I'll keep our main force close. If they betray us, we'll retaliate." Thus it was arranged. The next 3 days felt like a balancing act on a razor's edge. Robb's men scouted potential parley sites, trying to ensure no hidden archers or cavalry ambush might be waiting. He also drafted terms in writing, though he did not finalize them. The gist was that House Stark would pledge not to war upon the Tyrells or their domains, would promise open trade from the north once the fighting was done, and would allow some privileges at the port of White Harbor in exchange for Tyrell neutrality or a non-aggression pact. In time, if the Tyrells truly broke with the Lannisters, perhaps they might become allies in removing Lannister influence from the Riverlands. But that might be too bold an offer at first. Robb reminded himself that House Tyrell had no motive to leap wholeheartedly into another war. The best he might gain was a guarantee they would not supply men for Tywin's planned northern invasion. Finally, the appointed day dawned cold and gray, with a damp wind blowing from the Blackwater Bay. Robb rose early, donned his best leathers and furs, and strapped on his sword. The Great John insisted on accompanying him, as did Karstark. Robb consented, though he made it clear they must remain calm and diplomatic. They selected a handful of men to join them, no more than 15. Lady Rosalind also wished to attend, but Robb advised her to remain behind. She had already performed a great service. In truth, he did not want her at risk. She acquiesced, though with some reluctance. They rode to the chosen field, which lay about a mile north of the Tyrell camp. Snow had begun to swirl, speckling the brownish grass. Robb's retinue formed up in a loose semicircle. On the far side, a party emerged bearing the Golden Rose sigil. At their head, sitting primly upon a pale mare, was Lady Olenna Tyrell. She was muffled in a heavy cloak, and beside her rode Margaery, also cloaked. A handful of Tyrell knights escorted them, among them the noted warrior Brienne of Tarth. Though the woman once served Renly, it was said the Tyrells had employed her after his death, or so rumor had it. Robb wondered if that rumor was accurate, for he had heard that Brienne was last seen escorting Jaime Lannister under strange circumstances. But who could say in these tumultuous times? When the two groups faced each other, Lady Olenna raised a hand. Robb dismounted and approached on foot. Olenna Tyrell did the same, though with some difficulty, aided by a young attendant. Margaery followed, her face partly hidden by her hood. Robb gave a courteous bow, though not overly deep. He was a king, after all. "Lady Tyrell," he said, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting." She sniffed, eyeing him up and down. "So you're the young wolf everyone prattles on about. Goodness, you're younger than I expected. And taller." She nodded curtly, then turned her attention to the Great John, whose imposing form overshadowed her. "Don't loom so, you great bear. I'm not here to be eaten." The Great John let out a hearty chuckle. "I wouldn't dream of it, my lady. Not without salt and bread first." "Humph," Olenna replied. "At least you have a sense of humor. Where is your mother, boy?" "I had hoped to speak with the famous Catelyn Tully." Robb tried not to let the mention of his mother stir too much longing. "She's away, pursuing other efforts to end this war," he said. "I speak for the North in her stead." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Olenna murmured. "Well then, present your case, King in the North. My bones are too old to stand out here in the snow for idle chatter." Robb suppressed a small smile. At least she was direct. He began by outlining that House Stark sought independence for the North, and, in time, a restoration of the Riverlands to Tully control without Lannister interference. He wished no harm upon the Reach, nor upon House Tyrell. He respected their domain and their might, but if Tywin pressed a war of annihilation against him, he would resist to the last breath, and thousands more would die. It served neither side to slaughter each other pointlessly. He then broached the notion of a non-aggression pact. House Tyrell would withhold its armies from marching north in exchange for guaranteed trade rights with White Harbor and certain northern resources, timber, furs, and fish at preferential rates. He also hinted that if the Tyrells truly broke from the Lannisters, House Stark might pledge support in maintaining security around the Reach's shipping lanes. It was all theoretical, but it offered Lady Olenna a glimpse of potential profit and advantage. When he finished, she pursed her lips. Margaery spoke next, her voice quiet yet clear, a faint tremor in it that might have been from the cold. "King Robb, you speak persuasively, but my father is not so easily turned away from an alliance he believes is all but sealed. With poor Joffrey's death, Tommen is now king, and father wishes me to marry him. If that union is to happen, the Tyrells will stand beside the crown, one that Tywin Lannister effectively wears." Robb gave a small nod. "I understand, but I ask you to consider that Tywin Lannister is not immortal. His hold on the Iron Throne depends on Fae, Aer, and gold. If House Tyrell sees more benefit in neutrality, or in forging a new path for the realm, you might spare your people a costly war. And if, in the future, House Tyrell decides to pursue greater independence from the Iron Throne, you would find friends among the Northern Lords." Lady Olenna sniffed again. Independence, is it? You make it sound so simple, dear boy. The North is vast and remote, easy enough to keep. But the Reach is at the heart of the realm's breadbasket, connected to all manner of trade. The Lannisters to the west, Dorne to the south, the Crownlands to the east. Everyone would have a nibble. If Mace Tyrell tries to break free, we might find ourselves dancing with a dozen enemies. No, I have no illusions about grand secession. But neutrality? Possibly. Especially if those dreadful Lannisters continue to offend me. She tapped her cane on the cold ground. Haven't I heard that your father, Ned Stark, was it? Had a good friend in that Robert Baratheon? That's how these rebellions begin, by forging relationships. But times have changed. The game is more complex these days. The question is whether we truly trust you to keep your word. Your father was an honorable sort, but he lost his head for that. How do we know you won't lose yours as well, boy? Robb's face hardened at the mention of his father's execution, but he forced himself to remain calm. Our word is our bond. We have proven it once, by keeping the vow to House Frye despite the cost to me personally. I do not claim to be perfect, but the North has always stood by its oaths. If you enter into an agreement with us, we will not break it lightly. Olenna stared at him, her old eyes bright with interest. Then she looked at Marjorie, who had lowered her gaze, and back to Robb. And what of the Tullus in the Riverlands? Are they equally steadfast? I was under the impression that Riverrun stands with you. Would they honor such a pact? They would. My uncle, Edmure Tully, is currently at Harrenhal, holding it against Lannister aggression. Once this war ends, the Tullus will do whatever is necessary to rebuild the Riverlands and restore trade, especially down the Mander and around the southern coasts if we can find stability. Harrenhal, Olenna repeated with a sniff. That dreadfully large ruin. Well, let him keep that black tomb if he likes. No great prize for me. As for trade, my dear boy, let me be plain. If the Tyrells do not ride north with Tywin, it will be because we see no profit in it, or because we see a deeper profit in letting you stand. So let us speak of specifics. Gold, shipping, future alliances by marriage. These are what drive great houses. The Starks are too far removed for many direct ties, but the Tullus are more accessible. Do you have cousins to wed? Siblings? Robb swallowed. My brothers are believed dead or missing. Bran and Rickon. My sister Sansa. We know not if she's truly escaped. Arya is lost as well. We do have Tully cousins, perhaps, but at the moment that is uncertain. Lady Rosalind has brothers, but they are Freys. Not sure if that helps. He realized how precarious his house's position was. So many potential matches lost to war and tragedy. If House Tyrell requires a marriage alliance, we can explore it. But for now, I can only promise we'll stand by our word in trade and mutual non-aggression. Olenna made a tisk sound. Marriage alliances are not strictly necessary, but they do help keep the realms stitched together. Still, I won't dismiss the notion. For now, consider me mildly intrigued. I will speak to my dolt of a son, Mace, though I suspect he'll be more interested in the new King Tommen. If Tywin sweetens the pot enough, I doubt Mace will defy him. But if Tywin stumbles, or if more scandal emerges from that wretched city, my dear Marjorie might be compelled to find another path. We shall see. Robb inclined his head. You have my thanks, Lady Olenna. Then, bracing himself, he added, I would have your word that, in the meantime, you will not lend your swords to Tywin for any immediate march north. She arched an eyebrow. My word, you say? I am but an old woman. The men who command those swords are my son and his sworn lords. But I can strongly influence them. Let us say we'll remain hesitant to commit. I'll entreat Mace to wait, to see if a better opportunity arises. The Lannisters are stretched, what with that fool Tyrion on trial, accusations flying about. Young Tommen is easily led, but even so, the climate in King's Landing is unsettled. My son might see wisdom in not rushing an offensive while the city is still in turmoil. That alone might spare many lives, Robb said. And if, in time, House Tyrell finds cause to side openly with us or remain neutral, I will see that you benefit from it. House Stark and House Tully will not forget the favor. Olenna nodded, as if impatient. Words, words. We'll see. For now, we part as neither enemies nor friends, but possible correspondents. Bring me more news, boy, if you have any clever ideas for toppling Tywin Lannister. If you do, I might be persuaded to sharpen the thorns on my rose." She turned away. Marjorie gave Robb a gentle smile, one that conveyed both sympathy and caution, before following her grandmother to their horses. Robb watched them ride off. The Great John rumbled, "Well, that old woman has a sharper tongue than I've ever heard, but she didn't bite us. That's progress, eh?" "It's something," Robb agreed. He felt neither triumphant nor defeated. It was more akin to an uneasy stalemate. But the fact that Olenna Tyrell was open to waiting, delaying any assault on the north, was a significant achievement. If that gave them time, perhaps they could secure more alliances, or perhaps more chaos in King's Landing would undermine Tywin's hold on power. He and his retinue departed the field, returning to the woods where the rest of their men awaited. Once there, Robb summoned his principal bannermen to recount the conversation. Karstark's scowl deepened at the mention that no formal alliance had been forged, only a vague promise that the Tyrells would delay. "That old crone might change her mind tomorrow if Tywin waves enough gold in her face," he warned. "True," Robb said, "but for now we have gained a reprieve. Tywin will not easily march north alone without the Tyrells. His own forces are not as large as before, and he must keep a garrison in King's Landing. Plus, he deals with internal strife, Tyrion's trial, presumably the demands of the Iron Throne, and all sorts of issues with the Riverlords resisting him. That means we can reposition, gather more strength, and seek out further alliances." The Great John pounded a fist into his palm. "Does that mean we head back to Harrenhal? Or do we remain here in the Crownlands, hoping for another meeting?" Before Robb could answer, a rider approached, carrying a message that had arrived by Raven. Robb took the sealed parchment, recognized the sigil as from Harrenhal. He tore it open. The letter was from his uncle Edmure Tully, co-signed by Roose Bolton. Tywin Lannister was massing men near the Blackwater and rumored to be heading west, possibly to quell rebellious lords in the Reach who had begun questioning the Lannister hold on the throne. That was good news in that he wasn't heading north, but it also meant Harrenhal remained unchallenged for the moment. Still, the letter urged Robb to be cautious, for the Riverlands were vulnerable if Tywin changed course unexpectedly. Robb finished reading and decided the best course was to move his host a bit farther north to a secure position, possibly near the border between the Crownlands and the Riverlands, so that they could react quickly if Tywin reversed direction. He did not want to remain too close to the Tyrell camp, lest they feel threatened or suspect his intentions. If Lady Olenna wanted further contact, they could exchange riders or covert envoys. For the next few weeks, at least, the North might be spared an immediate invasion. That night, Robb took some time to speak privately with Lady Rosslyn. She seemed relieved to have concluded her mission safely and eager to hear how the parley went. When Robb described Olenna's shrewd manner, Rosslyn allowed a small smile. "I suspect the entire realm is at the mercy of such cunning minds," she said. "But I'm glad you found a glimmer of hope, even a small one." He nodded, searching her eyes. "None of this would have happened without you, my lords, or I might never have gained an audience with the Tyrells. You opened that door." She blushed faintly. "I only did what I could. You're the one they call the young wolf. I'm just a girl who grew up in the Twins, always overshadowed by my father's brood. Sometimes She hesitated, then went on. "Sometimes I worry that I have no real place in this war, that I'm just a convenient piece in the game. But if I can do any good, well, then maybe the gods placed me here for that reason." Robb could not deny that their marriage had begun as a purely political arrangement. Yet he found himself taking her hand. "You have done much good, Rosslyn. My men see it too. You've helped ease tensions with the Freys, you've shown bravery. And I thank you." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing more, only nodded. The war did not allow them much space for sentiment. Still, that night they shared a tent, and for a time the burdens of the realm seemed to recede. Robb lay awake afterward, mind drifting over the endless tasks ahead, securing the Riverlands, gleaning further advantage from the Tyrell hesitation, discovering the fate of Sansa, possibly forging alliances with the Vale if Baelish was open to it. The South was a labyrinth of schemes, and he was only beginning to understand its intricacy. Over the next several days, Robb slowly withdrew his force from the immediate vicinity of King's Landing. They marched north, crossing half-frozen rivers and passing by hamlets ravaged by war. Occasionally, they dispatched small groups to gather intelligence. Reports trickled in that Tywin was indeed focusing westward, dealing with unrest in the Reach. Perhaps some ambitious minor lords there saw a chance to break free or demand concessions in the wake of Joffrey's death. That meant the road to the Riverlands was relatively open, though Lannister patrols still roamed. Halfway back to Harrenhal, they encountered a frantic party of refugees who claimed they had fled from the Crownlands due to roving sellswords who robbed and killed without allegiance to any great house. Robb gave them what food he could spare and urged them to head for Riverrun, where Edmure Tully was trying to maintain some measure of order. The refugees recognized the direwolf banner and knelt before Robb, calling him their king. As they moved on, the Great John shook his head. "See how they look to you now? The realm is in tatters. They'll clutch at any hope." Robb was silent for a moment. The burdens of kingship pressed heavily upon him. He had wanted to avenge his father, free the North, protect his people. Instead, he found himself entangled in a wider civil war, with the fate of thousands beyond the neck depending on what the king in the North did next. The only solace was that he knew they had prevented one of the war's darkest events, the Red Wedding. Had he broken his pact with Walder Frey, everything might have collapsed in a single bloody night. At least that doom had been averted. Eventually, the column arrived once more at Harrenhal's blackened gates, greeted by the grim banners of House Stark and House Tully. Edmure Tully hurried out to meet them in the courtyard. Snow flurries drifted around those massive, fire-scorched walls. Edmure had a haggard look. Clearly the seat of ghosts did not suit him. He managed a weary smile for Robb, though. "My king," he said, offering a slight bow. "Welcome back. Things have been relatively quiet. Roose Bolton has been seeing to the fortress defenses and drilling the men. The Riverlands are battered but holding. No sign of Tywin." "That's some relief," Robb said. He looked around, taking stock of the numbers in the courtyard. "Where is Lord Bolton now?" "In one of the lesser halls," Edmure answered. "He set up a personal command post." Robb nodded, though he felt a pang of wariness. Roose Bolton's methods had never felt entirely trustworthy, and leaving him to his own devices for so long was unsettling. But for now, Bolton had done what was required. He had held Harrenhal and not betrayed the king in the north. Robb dismounted and signaled for his lords to do likewise. The garrison welcomed them, though the presence of so many men weighed heavily on the fortress's supplies. Winter loomed, and Harrenhal's storerooms were never truly full, given its vast size. They would need to manage rations carefully if they planned to hold it through the cold months. Once Robb had refreshed himself, he sought out Roose Bolton. He found the man in a dim chamber once used by the castle steward, poring over a table strewn with documents and maps. Bolton rose at Robb's approach and inclined his head with that peculiar air of polite detachment. "Your Grace, I hear you've gleaned interesting tidings in the Crownlands." Robb studied him. Bolton's pale eyes were difficult to read. "Yes, we have reason to believe the Tyrells are hesitant to march north. Lady Olenna Tyrell hinted at neutrality, at least for the moment. Tywin is dealing with unrest in the Reach. So we are spared from immediate assault," Bolton said softly. "A boon for us, and for you more time to plan your next move. I have also heard from my ravens that Lady Catelyn was sighted near the Bloody Gate, traveling with Ser Brynden Tully. It seems she might be attempting to treat with Lysa Arryn or test the Vale's willingness to join our cause." Robb's eyebrows rose. "You've had word of my mother?" "A small rumor, confirmed by some sellsword band that was turned away at the Vale's border. They claim to have seen a woman with auburn hair, accompanied by a black fish sigil. The Vale remains closed, though. Lady Lysa doesn't let armies cross so easily." Robb nodded, a swirl of relief and apprehension in him. If Catelyn was truly near the Vale, It meant she was alive and still working for the Starks. But Lysa's refusal to intervene in the war was well known. Peter Baelish, however, might be weaving his own schemes there. Would that help or hinder Catelyn's efforts? Bolton resumed his seat, smoothing his pale hands. The question remains, Your Grace. How shall we use this reprieve? We could fortify Harrenhal further, or even attempt to retake certain strong points in the Westerlands while Tywin is distracted. A bold strike at the Lannisters' home fields might force a quicker settlement. Or perhaps we wait, hoping Tywin's troubles increase. Robb frowned, remembering the price of reckless offensives. He had won battles on Westerland soil before, but each victory stretched his lines thinner, culminating in disaster at times. I won't risk a rash campaign, he said. We might try to gain more local allies first. The Riverlords who are still wavering, like the ones who bent the knee to the Lannisters out of fear, could be persuaded to rejoin us if we can ensure their lands are safe. If we unify the Riverlands fully behind us, Tywin's hold there will be gone. Bolton inclined his head. A prudent approach. I shall assist in that effort if you wish. My men are adept at persuasion. Robb felt a flicker of unease, recalling stories of the Dreadfort's cruel methods. A gentle persuasion, if possible. We want the Riverlords to stand with us willingly, not out of terror. Of course, Your Grace. Bolton's tone was unreadable. In the weeks that followed, Robb enacted that plan. He dispatched envoys to various houses in the Riverlands. Harrenhal was an impressive seat from which to bargain, though its gloom did little to inspire cheer. Houses such as the Brackens, the Pipers, the Vansess, and the Mutons were approached. Some still nursed wounds from Lannister raids. They had a choice: remain beholden to the Iron Throne, or stand with the king in the north, who at least had proven he could defend them by capturing Harrenhal and defeating Lannister forces multiple times. Many responded favorably, sending small groups of men or at least proclaiming renewed fealty to House Tully. Others, traumatized by the war, gave half-hearted responses. But slowly, the Riverlands inched back into open support of the Starks and Tullis. During this time, Lady Rosslyn quietly continued her role as a soothing presence, meeting with the wives and daughters of lesser lords who visited Harrenhal, bridging the gap between the Northmen's gruffness and the Riverlanders' caution. She even wrote letters to some Frykin who lingered at the Twins, encouraging them to support the realm's stability by re-establishing trade routes. Walder Frey rarely missed a chance to wring advantage out of others, but as long as Robb remained loyal to his marriage vow, Walder was content to keep the crossing open. Winter sank its teeth into the land. Snow fell more heavily each week, piling in drifts along the castle's outer wards. Fires blazed in the great hall, but the heat never seemed to chase the chill from Harrenhal's vast corridors. Soldiers fell ill with coughs and fevers. The short days made everything feel more oppressive. Rumors from afar were as scarce as sunlight. Word came that Tyrion Lannister stood trial in King's Landing, with some sensational developments, that Oberyn Martell of Dorne had arrived to serve as a judge, seeking justice for his sister's murder by the Mountain, who was now known to be dead at Harrenhal's courtyard. That single fact might mean Oberyn's thirst for vengeance would turn upon other Lannisters. Another swirl in the endless storm of politics. Robb tried not to let the gloom overcome him. He maintained daily drills for the men, ensuring discipline. He met regularly with Edmure and Roose Bolton to track supply levels. He read every Raven's message from the north, the Riverlands, or the Vale, gleaning what he could. At times, he walked the ramparts with Grey Wind, gazing over the snow-shrouded landscape. He wondered if this war would ever end or if it would simply freeze the realm into a perpetual stalemate. Then, late one afternoon, a breathless scout arrived from the south, battered by the cold. He brought news that King's Landing was in upheaval once more. Tyrion Lannister had demanded a trial by combat, Oberyn Martell had volunteered to fight for him, and the champion for the crown was said to be none other than Gregor Clegane. Only that was impossible, for Gregor Clegane lay dead at Harrenhal, or so everyone believed. The scout sputtered that the crown was passing off some massive knight as the Mountain, claiming he was Gregor, though rumors abounded that it was someone else behind the visor. Regardless, the trial by combat had ended in a gruesome spectacle. Oberyn Martell was slain. Yet in so doing, he had grievously wounded the crown's champion. Tyrion Lannister was still condemned. King's Landing seethed with tension, and Dorne howled for vengeance. Robb took this in with a profound sense of unreality. The war had not only shattered alliances but also birthed bizarre lies. The Lannisters parading some impostor as Gregor Clegane to preserve their myth of invincibility. Or perhaps the real Gregor had indeed been mortally wounded in the courtyard but lingered in agony, spirited away by Qyburn's experiments. Robb had heard murmurings of that name, a disgraced maester who might have performed unnatural procedures. The swirl of half-truths and illusions made it hard to discern fact from fiction. But one fact stood out: Oberyn Martell's death would set Dorne against the Lannisters in fury, another wedge in Tywin's crumbling alliances. It was precisely the kind of fracturing that might give the North an even greater advantage. If Dorne turned hostile to the Iron Throne, Tywin would have to handle that front. Already, the Tyrells were half-hearted in their support. The Iron Islands were in chaos after Balon Greyjoy's death. If ever the time was ripe for the North and Riverlands to assert independence, it was now. But how to formalize it? Tywin would never simply give the North away without forcing a confrontation. And that confrontation, at the wrong time or place, could still cost Robb everything. Roose Bolton, surprisingly, approached Robb with a suggestion. Send an envoy directly to King's Landing, requesting a peace conference with the boy King Tommen. Offer to exchange prisoners, perhaps. We still hold some Lannister men. The crown holds your sister, if she is indeed in their grasp. If the crown is preoccupied with Dorne and other issues, they might be more amenable to granting the North independence in exchange for a formal alliance or treaty. We might promise them shipments of grain or resources once winter breaks. Robb eyed Bolton carefully. I'd not trust the Lannisters' word, nor do I believe they'll free Sansa for a few foot soldiers. Bolton shrugged, his voice smooth. They might if they see your cause as unstoppable. Tywin is cunning enough to cut losses where needed, and if your sister is truly missing, then the crown has no direct hold on her. The point is to push for an agreement that cements the North as sovereign. You might even allow them to keep nominal overlordship of the Riverlands, if that is acceptable to Edmure Tully, though I doubt it. Robb's jaw tightened. The Riverlands are loyal to my mother's house. I won't sell them back to the Lannisters. No, the Tullys deserve their freedom as well. As for your idea, I'll consider it, but I suspect we'd be best served forging more chaos among Tywin's ranks rather than parleying with him. If Dorne, the Tyrells, and other factions rise against the Lannisters, we can hold our territory in peace. Bolton bowed his head in acquiescence. As you command, your grace. As the days dragged on, the fracturing in the south became more pronounced. Fresh letters arrived from Rosby and Duskendale, describing how caravans from Dorne were turned away from King's Landing, how Tywin scrambled to placate the Martells by offering Myrcella Baratheon's hand or some other gesture. But the Martells thirsted for revenge, not marriage. Tensions with the Tyrells simmered. The entire capital felt like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. In the relative calm of Harrenhal, Robb received a raven from Lady Olenna Tyrell herself, a short missive that read, Boy Wolf, your guess was right. The vipers are stirring. My dolt of a son dithers. Our alliance with the Lannisters stands on uncertain ground. If you have cunning enough to seize advantage of the chaos, do so, but do not look for me to openly defy them, yet. I am no fool, nor do I gamble my family's safety. If you do happen to catch Tywin in a net of your own making, let me know. Perhaps a well-timed tug on the rope will help you tighten it. Olenna Tyrell. Robb felt a grim satisfaction. The note confirmed that Tywin's hold on House Tyrell was weak. If only there were a way to strike swiftly at Tywin himself, perhaps capturing him or forcing him into a corner. But that was no small task. He had an army, a capital, and cunning beyond measure. Still, the more isolated Tywin became, the more likely he would be forced to the negotiating table. That might be the surest path to an official peace that recognized northern independence. By now, the snows had grown thick around Harrenhal. Travel was slow and treacherous. Robb had no wish to attempt a winter campaign deep into the Crownlands or Westerlands. Instead, He focused on fortifying positions in the Riverlands and reorganizing the northern forces, sending some men back to the north to bolster the defense of Moat Cailin and the coasts against any ironborn stragglers. He also oversaw the slow reconstruction of Winterfell from afar, dispatching masons and supplies whenever possible. Letters from White Harbor assured him that Lord Manderley was gathering wealth and resources to help rebuild. If the war would only end, the North might flourish again one day. A month passed with no major battles, an uneasy lull in the War of the Five Kings. Tommen Baratheon's coronation was overshadowed by Tyrion's imprisonment, by Oberyn Martell's death, and by rumors that Tywin and Cersei were scrambling to keep the realm from fracturing further. Stannis Baratheon, if he remained a contender, had yet to make a decisive move. Some said he was gathering forces at the Wall, battling wildlings, or forging alliances with northern clans loyal to the old ways. That was a puzzle Robb couldn't quite fathom. What was Stannis doing so far from the Iron Throne he supposedly wanted? Still, for all the chaos, one bright piece of news emerged. From the Vale came word, whispered by merchants, that Catelyn Stark had met with Lady Lysa Arryn. The details were murky, but the gist was that Lysa, newly wed to Peter Baelish, was reluctant to commit the Vale's knights to any war, citing her fear for her young son. Yet, rumor had it that Baelish himself was making overtures to unify the Vale and the Riverlands under some arrangement that would keep Lysa placated and set Baelish up as a power broker. Catelyn might have found a compromise. The Vale would not oppose the Starks, at least, and might even send a token force to help retake scattered Tully lands if the price was right. That was a far cry from a full alliance, but any Vale support would be welcome. Amid these swirling developments, Robb received yet another visitor. A small group traveling under a white banner, claiming to come from King's Landing in peace. They arrived at Harrenhal's gate one chilly afternoon, escorted inside by vigilant Stark guards. At their head was a young man with gold hair, bearing a parchment stamped with the royal seal. He introduced himself as Ser Adam Marbrand, a known Lannister bannerman. Robb recognized the name. Marbrand was one of Tywin's more honorable lieutenants. The parchment was addressed to Robb Stark, King in the North. Robb took it to his solar with Edmure, Bolton, and a few trusted lords in attendance. He broke the seal and read, a summons from the Crown, offering a meeting in neutral territory, a place near the Trident, to discuss a potential end to hostilities. Tommen Baratheon extended this invitation on behalf of the Crown, in the spirit of preserving the realm. Though Robb suspected Tywin was the real author, the letter was elegantly worded, referencing the desire to spare further bloodshed, to restore rightful order, and to negotiate the status of the North and the Riverlands. It did not guarantee any outcomes, of course, but it did invite Robb to come parley in good faith. Karstark scoffed. A trap. Tywin wants your head as he wanted your father's. Bolton's cool voice interjected. Or it might be a genuine attempt to find a solution. Tywin is not above making a deal if the realm's stability depends on it. The question is whether they'll truly offer the North independence, or if they only mean to lure us into captivity. Robb read the letter again. The mention of Sansa was absent, but he spied a line about all outstanding claims and hostages to be resolved. A possible hint that they'd bargain her freedom if she was indeed in their custody. He looked at Edmure. What do you think, uncle? Edmure sighed. If it means a chance to end the war, I say meet them, but do so carefully. Bring your best men, prepare an escape route, choose the ground yourself. If Tywin double-crosses us, we'll fight our way out. Robb nodded grimly. The letter suggested a meeting near the Crossroads Inn, which had changed hands multiple times in the war. It was central, near the Trident, on the edge of the Riverlands. That might be acceptable, though Robb would insist on controlling the area thoroughly. He looked to Ser Adam Marbrand, who awaited outside. What do we know of his honor? He's one of Tywin's loyal knights, known to be more principled than most Lannisters, Edmure said. Still a formidable warrior, though. Robb rubbed a hand across his jaw. All right, I'll meet with him, alone, and see what else he can tell us. Then I'll decide. He motioned for the guards to bring Marbrand. When Ser Adam entered, he removed his helm and bowed. He had a well-groomed beard and a serious expression. "Your Grace, thank you for granting an audience." Rob regarded him warily. "You wish me to treat with the crown about peace. Yet the crown's hand in my father's death, my mother's torment, and my sister's captivity remains a bitter wound. Why should I trust your entreaty?" Marbrand's voice was steady. "You have every cause for anger, Your Grace, but you must see that the realm is tearing itself apart. The crown is in dire straits. Dorne stirs for vengeance. The Tyrells brood with discontent. Banditry spreads. The king, young Tommen, wishes to end the bloodshed where he can. If you present your terms, Lord Tywin will hear them, so long as they do not upend the entire realm's foundation." He paused. "I will not lie to you. Independence for the North is not a trivial matter. But perhaps we can negotiate a form of autonomy. As for your family, if Lady Sansa can be found, I believe the crown would willingly release her to your keeping in exchange for a durable peace." Rob's heart pounded at the mention of Sansa. This was the first explicit statement from a Lannister bannerman that she might be freed. He forced himself to remain stern. "If I come, I will come with an armed escort of my choosing. The site of the parley will be fully scouted by my men. No hidden crossbows, no betrayals. If I see any sign of duplicity, I will ride back to Harrenhal and continue this war until your heads line my walls." Marbrand inclined his head gravely. "Understood, Your Grace. I will relay your conditions to Lord Tywin. If he consents, we will arrange the details. I pledge on my honor that I will do what I can to ensure this meeting is genuine." Rob studied him for a moment, searching for falsehood. "Very well. You'll remain at Harrenhal as my guest until I receive Tywin's response." Marbrand made no protest, though a flicker in his eyes suggested he understood the meaning. He was a hostage, albeit a courteous one. Rob dismissed him, instructing servants to provide him with a guest chamber under guard. Once the night had gone, Karstark spat. "This is madness. Meeting Tywin for peace? I swore vengeance for my sons. We all swore vengeance for Lord Stark." Rob met the older man's gaze. "Vengeance or peace? Are you so blind to the realm's suffering? We can't fight forever. If there's a way to secure the North's freedom, and the Riverlands without more deaths, I must consider it. My father would have done the same." Karstark's mouth twisted. "Your father was too honorable for his own good. Look what it cost him. But you are my king, so I will follow your lead." He bowed stiffly and stalked off. That left Rob with Edmure, Bolton, Rosalind, and a few others. Rosalind gently touched Rob's arm. "I know you want to save Sansa. I pray that this leads to her. But please be careful." He squeezed her hand. "I will. We'll see if Tywin truly wants peace or if this is another Lannister ploy. If it's a trap, we'll expose it." Bolton cleared his throat. "An armed escort can only do so much if Tywin arrives with 1,000 men. We should be prepared. I recommend placing men in hidden vantage points around the crossroads inn, archers in the trees, cavalry in the hills, ready to strike if needed." Rob agreed, though he hoped it would not come to violence. Over the next few days, ravens flew back and forth between Harrenhal and King's Landing. Each message hammered out the rules of engagement for this proposed peace summit. Tywin insisted on bringing a personal guard. Rob insisted on limiting the total number for both sides. Eventually, they agreed that each side could bring no more than 50 men, with no further forces within a league. A formal truce would be declared for the duration of the meeting, and the location chosen was indeed near the Crossroads Inn, a place well known to travelers. Ser Adam Marbrand was released to carry Tywin's official acceptance, then returned. The date was set. Edmure was uneasy. "This is precisely how your father was betrayed, by trusting the crown's promise of peace." Rob exhaled slowly. "I remember, but father walked into the lion's den alone, with no army behind him. This time I will bring the great Jon Karstark and others. We'll have outriders scouring the area, hidden watchers ready to pounce if Tywin tries any sleight of hand. I won't let them blindfold me with words." The appointed day dawned bleak and cold, the sky leaden with clouds that threatened more snow. Robb led a carefully chosen company of 50. Among them were the great Jon Karstark, Roose Bolton, Lord Jason Mallister, who had come from Seaguard to discuss Riverland's matters, and a handful of loyal knights and archers. Rosalind had begged to remain behind this time, and Robb agreed. Too dangerous by far. He left her in Harrenhal, guarded by Edmure's men. Grey Wind padded at Robb's side, a silent embodiment of northern ferocity. They arrived at the crossroads inn after a slow trek over icy roads. The inn itself was a battered structure, having changed hands repeatedly in the war. Outside, in a broad snowy clearing, banners fluttered. The Lannister lion, the crowned stag and lion of the Baratheon Lannister monarchy, and some lesser houses. Robb's men formed up on one side, mindful to keep an arrow's flight from the Lannister guard. The watchers on both sides looked tense, hands never straying far from their swords or bows. But no immediate hostility erupted. Robb dismounted, accompanied by a handful of lords. From the Lannister party stepped Tywin Lannister himself, resplendent in fur-trimmed armor, face as cold as the winter air. Beside him came a small retinue: Kevan Lannister, Pycelle the Grand Maester, and several knights including Meryn Trant and a new face concealed behind a dark helm. Robb's gaze flicked to that figure, wondering if it was some monstrous champion they'd brought in place of the mountain. Unsettling. But Tywin walked forward, every inch the commanding lord. "King Robb," Tywin said in a clipped tone, using the royal style with a faint sneer, "I trust you've been well. Harrenhal suits you, I hear." Robb kept his voice level. "Lord Tywin, I received your summons. Let us speak plainly. You proposed peace. I propose independence for the North and the Riverlands, the release or safe return of my sisters, and the safe withdrawal of all Lannister forces from our lands." Tywin's green eyes gleamed with disdain. "You do not mince words. You demand half the realm and the crown's wards in exchange for what precisely?" "For an end to the fighting," Robb said, raising his chin. "For the security of King Tommen's southern borders, so he need not fear an invasion from the north. For potential trade and mutual assistance if the realm faces other threats." "And you imagine the crown will simply let you and the Tullus walk away from fealty?" Tywin's lip curled. "You Starks always believed honor could accomplish wonders. Your father clung to that notion, and we saw how that ended." Robb felt a pulse of anger. "I am not my father. I will not bend the knee to a throne stained by his blood. If you cannot accept that, then we have nothing more to discuss. We continue the war." Kevan Lannister tried to interject in a calmer tone. "Nephew, we must consider the kingdom's stability. The North is vast, and they have proven they will not be subjugated easily. Perhaps a compromise, some form of overlordship with wide autonomy." "No," Robb said firmly. "True independence or no deal." Tywin's glare could have sliced steel. A hush fell over both parties. Finally, he exhaled. "Such intransigence. Yet we stand here because the realm is indeed in peril from all sides. Dorne thirsts for vengeance, the Tyrells are uncertain, and the Iron Islands are ever a threat. If the crown is to remain secure, we must quell the myriad rebellions. Yet perhaps we can spare a portion of our attention for negotiation. But you must yield something in return, Stark. What guarantee do we have that once you are declared king in the North, you will not march south again at your leisure?" Robb swallowed back a retort. "I have no desire for further conquests. I want only my father's lands and justice for his murder. Let us sign a binding treaty. The North and the Riverlands will remain sovereign, neither crossing south so long as the crown does not cross north. We can exchange hostages, one from my side, one from yours, as a sign of good faith. If either side violates the peace, the hostages pay with their lives. As for my sisters, if Sansa is truly in your care, you will release her at once." Tywin paused, letting the wind whip at his fur mantle. "Hostages, is it? Peace of the old ways. And the Tullus? You speak for them as well." "Yes, my uncle Edmure Tully rules Riverrun. He stands with me. The Riverlands will never bow to the Lannisters again." Tywin gave a mirthless chuckle. "You are a bold young man, I'll grant you that. I see how you've kept your wolf at your side, trying to intimidate me with memories of Grey Wind's victories? Let us be clear. The crown still has tens of thousands of men. The Tyrells stand, uncertainly perhaps, but still they stand. The gold of Casterly Rock flows. Do not imagine this war is unwinnable for us. And do not imagine you can ride easily through the neck to subdue us, Robb countered. We've proven that before. Another long silence fell. Then Grand Maester Pycelle cleared his throat. Perhaps it would be prudent to continue this discussion indoors, away from the cold? The inn can provide a private space. No, Robb and Tywin said in unison, each not wanting to cede advantage by going inside. They exchanged a glare. Tywin turned to Kevan. Very well. Summon the notaries. We'll see if we can shape these demands into something resembling an accord. He glanced back at Robb. But understand this, boy. The crown will not lightly hand over half the realm. You will find our terms harsh. My father's murder was harsh, Robb growled. I will accept no less than the freedom he died for. They negotiated there in the snowy field for hours. The tension never lessened, with both sides hurling barbed remarks and refusing to budge on key points. Robb demanded Sansa's release. Tywin countered that the crown had no idea where she was, claiming she fled King's Landing the night Joffrey died. Robb refused to believe they had no leads, suspecting a lie, but Tywin insisted he was telling the truth. If we had her, we would use her as a hostage. Her disappearance has embarrassed us more than you realize. That revelation, if true, meant Sansa was indeed unaccounted for, possibly in the wind. Robb had to accept it grudgingly. As for Arya, no one had any knowledge. The demands regarding the Riverlands grew equally fraught. Tywin insisted the Tullys pay indemnities for the raids they led on Lannister lands. Robb refused. They went in circles until dusk threatened. Kevan Lannister tried to mediate, but the gulf remained wide. Finally, as the light faded, Tywin shook his head. I see little chance of a final accord tonight. Let us declare a short truce, 2 weeks, during which we will put these proposals in writing and weigh them carefully. We can meet again or exchange messages. In the meantime, neither side will engage in hostilities. Agreed. Robb eyed him warily. A 2-week truce might be a stalling tactic, or it might be a genuine respite. Still, it was better than open battle. Agreed, for now. They parted with stiff bows. Tywin's retinue rode south, while Robb's men headed north, each side leaving the crossroads behind like a battlefield unblooded. As they rode, Robb took stock of what he had gleaned. The Lannisters were more desperate than they cared to admit, or they wouldn't have come. But Tywin was far from broken. He had no intention of granting unconditional independence. This would be a long negotiation, and it might fail entirely. On the road back to Harrenhal, the Great John muttered that the entire parley had been a waste of time. Karstark remained silent, gloom clinging to him like a shadow. Roose Bolton, however, offered a different perspective. They asked for a truce. This means Tywin is buying time, likely to sort his issues with Dorne and the Tyrells. But so are we. Each day that passes allows the North to recover and solidify its position. This is not the worst outcome. Robb privately agreed. They had lost nothing but time. And if, in those 2 weeks, the cracks in Tywin's alliances widened, the crown might come back to the table in a weaker position. The king in the North could only hope that chaos continued to chip away at the Lannisters' might, while the North and the Riverlands stood firm, while Lady Olenna weighed her strategies, while Dorne seethed, while the Vale considered its next step, and while the Iron Islands remained in turmoil under Euron Greyjoy's wild ambitions. The war had become a web of shifting threads, and Robb aimed to keep them tangled around Tywin's throat. When they finally returned to Harrenhal, the men were exhausted, and darkness had fully fallen. Rosalind met Robb in the courtyard, braving the cold, looking anxious. He dismounted and embraced her briefly. We have a 2-week truce, he murmured. No more, but for now at least no one is dying. She clung to him, relief shining in her eyes. That's something, Robb. Perhaps it will turn into a lasting peace. He was too weary to muster false optimism. Perhaps, he said. Or perhaps it will end in blood. Either way, we're still here, and the Red Wedding never happened. Let the gods grant us the strength to see this through. She nodded, and together, they stepped into the shadowy halls of Harrenhal. Soldiers quickly took their horses. Snow blew in gusts across the courtyard, swirling around the black towers. Deep within the fortress, braziers burned, casting flickering orange light on stone walls. And in that space between night and firelight, Robb Stark felt the faint stirrings of hope tempered by caution. He had survived battles and betrayals. He had forged an alliance with Walder Frey instead of casting it aside. He had found a measure of diplomacy with House Tyrell, sowed seeds of confusion in King's Landing, and forced Tywin Lannister to come to the table, albeit grudgingly. Where it would lead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like years, Robb believed there was a future, one shaped not by a single savage betrayal at a wedding feast, but by patient, determined steps toward a victory the Starks could claim with honor intact. He would guard that future as fiercely as he guarded the North. And with winter tightening its hold, that resolve might be the only warmth left to him in a realm still on the brink of darkness.